Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I wanna talk about the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests or the Gelbwesten, how we call them in Germany. They are of course the protesters that we see in many areas all over France and even already in the Netherlands and in Belgium right now. So I have followed the news in recent days and weeks. I already made a video actually about the gas prices in France. I also looked at some French media, some French sources on the issue. My French is not that great, but if I look up a couple of words, I actually can understand it quite well still. And in this video today, I want to give you my view on the whole issue, on the protesters and on the situation in France right now. Now, of course, I'm not French. I don't live there. I never lived there. And I speak the language not very well. But this is my German perspective. And if you have a different opinion on some of the points or maybe on everything, please share it in the comments below. Now, so as I already told you in my first video on the topic, this was started by the plans of the French government to impose a new tax, a kind of a carbon tax on fuels, on gasoline and diesel fuel. Now then, it started actually from rural areas in France where people are really dependent on the car because the distances they have to cover are too great for a bicycle and there is no public transport like in a big city, like in Paris for example. There is no subway, there are not so many buses and trains to choose. And these people, they put on these yellow vests that they need to have in their car and they blocked roads and protested against the government. Now then, these protests spread all over the nation and especially in Paris, they became rather violent because people in the capital are not like the people in the rural areas. There are not only French people there, for example, and also their mentality is quite different. In Germany, you see the same thing when there is a G20 summit or when there is some of these Antifa events in Hamburg. It can become quite violent and they like to fight against the police and also to loot and to burn cars and buildings. Now this is something, and I want to stress this, that this is something that you see in lots of Anglo-Saxon and international media right now, this scandalization of these protests, but the pictures and videos you see are almost exclusively from Paris. In the rest of the country, as far as I have seen it and I've researched it, it was really more or less peaceful. And many of these yellow vests are actually not very fond of what the people are doing in Paris, giving their movement a very bad name with all these displays of violence. Also, especially in Paris, many other fringe movements have mingled now with these yellow vests. And you have, for example, now, of course, the anarchists, the Antifa guys who just want to loot stores. And then you have some Arabs who show some anti-Semitic hand gestures, for example, that are also not really in context of the original yellow vest movements, but they also put on yellow vests and they just think that they can do anything on the streets now. So just bear in mind that there is a difference between Paris and the rest of the country. So one could even say, and I have said that this is not about gas prices at all. That was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Because if everything were a-okay for those people and then the taxes on gasoline are increased, I think they wouldn't go into that much effort and create this riot or this protest here. No, I think a lot of other things must have been very bad before this plan of the carbon tax came even up. And Emmanuel Macron has already paddled back on his plan for the carbon tax. Well, at least he says he will not impose it for another 6 months, which is not to say that he will take it back entirely. But one can see clearly that even taking back temporarily this tax did not appease the protesters. And I think it shouldn't, because it is just, of course, playing on time. That's all that is. So one could say that this is a protest of the rural population, of the working class and lower middle class provincial population against the globalist elites from the big cities, these world citizens, these jet set French people. Now, I am in Germany, but I am also a person from a rural area. I grew up in a village and I still live in a very small town, and I always said I never want to live in a large German city. I even went that far to say that people from large cities are not really German. And in France, this is even much more extreme. So Germany doesn't really have a center. We are a federation, and there are many big cities where you can make it, where you have plenty of opportunities, like München or Stuttgart, Hamburg, Hannover, Köln, Bremen, Düsseldorf, so many cities, so many states, and you can make it anywhere, be it in science, in the industry, or in a small business, in the media or in fashion. There are many centers, and there is not one city where you really have to be. But in France, the system is different. This is a centralized nation, a central state, where Paris is the dominating center in any field almost. If you want to go places in journalism or in science or in the industry, in government, you have to go to Paris. But the hard-working people who pay most of the taxes are actually not living in the big city, they are living in the countryside. And the government spending in France, the infrastructure decisions that are being made, they favor the big city. So in terms of infrastructure spending, there is a clear discrimination, a clear exploitation actually of the rural population. The money, the tax money, is taken from them and it flows into the big cities and is spent there in terms of welfare and in terms of infrastructure. And the people in the countryside, they don't get to benefit from the universities or the museums or the government offices or the court buildings that are built in the big city. Their taxes are taken, but nothing comes back. And this used to be differently, at least in Germany, I can still remember, and I think in France it was the same way. There are many small towns in Germany where there were local courthouses, smaller local universities and schools or some kind of an educational institution. And as I said, public transport or even something as mundane as a post office or a local store. Nowadays, all these things close down. There are no more bus stops, no more train stations because it's no longer profitable. The post office is even closed down. So there are basically just a bunch of houses there. There is no infrastructure. And as I said, now with new technologies, you see that even when you want to be online or if you want to have a cell phone reception or something, you get in trouble or you just don't have these benefits when you are in a rural area. But you can still pay all the taxes for all those people in the cities who benefit from that then. So I can totally understand that they are angry, and it is not just about fuel prices, it's about the justice or the fairness between the rural population and the bourgeoisie and the foreign guests in big cities, where all the tax money goes to. So it is about taxation, but not just on the one hand side, what you have to pay, but also how this money is spent. And in France, this is really important because I did actually a little bit of research, economic research, very blunt one, but nevertheless, if you look at the numbers in France, there is a very important quantity. We call it Staatsquote in German, and that is the ratio of the government spending in GDP. That means if you have 100 euros, how many euros of these 100 euros on average in a nation belong to the state? So if that number were 50%, that would mean that 50% of the wealth of a nation or of GDP or wealth is owned by the industry or by private households, and the other 50% is owned by the state. And in France, this number is a whopping 56%. That means more than 50% of the wealth of the French nation is in the hands of the state. So the state is obviously a very important actor in the field of French economics and cannot be discarded. Now in Germany, this number is much lower. It is only 44%. Still way too high for my personal taste, but it is what it is. France is really much more socialistic than Germany. Much more wealth is controlled by the state and not so much by the private households and the industry. That, combined with the already mentioned centralized nature of France, makes this problem, this disparity, this asymmetry between rural areas and the cities much more severe than in Germany. And if you add on top of that Germans have a reputation for having a very high tolerance for suffering through injustice and carrying the load until they absolutely can't, whereas French people, let's just say they have a lower ignition point than us. They chimp out much sooner than we do, and they should be blessed for that. Not always, but sometimes I think Germans are a little bit too extreme, too bovine maybe, and our tolerance for injustice and unjust burdens is just way too high for our own good. So this is why I repeat again, I really understand where these people are coming from, and I differentiate between the rather peaceful protesters in the rural areas and the thugs and looters in Paris. That being said, I have heard today that even in Paris it was mostly peaceful. So most of the French people that came to Paris were really peaceful, and there are just some fringe groups that really infiltrate the Gilets jaunes. They just put on the yellow vest and they do what they would do if it was a G20 summit, for example. They are just anarchists who want to loot stores. And let me go on a little tangent here. When it comes to this looting, the German side of me, or well, I actually only have a German side, there is no other side to me, but my German nature, my German instinct tells me, put them down, arrest them, throw them in jail, or well, use the guns that you have. I have really zero tolerance for this looting, and this has something to do with rural versus city, because these days in Western Europe or also in Germany, many big cities are multicultural areas. And that means that the people that live side by side do not share a tribal identity. They don't think, and they actually don't, they don't belong to the same tribe, to the same group. So I live in a rural area, for example. I spend most of my money in my own community here. I know my baker and I know my butcher, and they're my neighbors really. When I go there, I have a little chat with them and I talk about the events of the week. And if, for example, there was some kind of an extreme situation like a natural disaster or some uprising, and we would know that if we called the cops, they would not come, that we're on our own, it would be the last thing on my mind to break into my neighbors' businesses and steal their property and set the place on fire. These are my neighbors. I would protect their businesses. I wouldn't loot. And in these big cities, you see that people are actually looting stores that are right next to their apartments. They are basically their neighbors. And this is a property of big city life that appalls me. People don't know their neighbors. They don't have anything in common with them, and they don't feel any kind of link to them. They feel no connection to them. That is appalling and disgusting. And it is a fundamental property of a big, modern, multicultural city. And this is why you see this behavior in the United States, you see it in London, you see it in Paris, and you don't see it in Japan, for example. Japan has many earthquakes or volcano eruptions or these tsunamis or something like that. And there are many situations where they know that the cops or the authorities, they cannot respond. That if you did something, the police couldn't really stop you. But you don't see any looting. People are cooperating, they're helping each other because they know that they're all Japanese. They're all one group. They're not neighbors all technically, some of them are, but they know that they are an extended family, that they are a tribe. And I would respond in the same way if something like that happened in my area. And this is the difference to a big multicultural city where certain elements among the population there, they're just waiting for this situation where they know that the cops cannot respond because of some emergency, and the first thing they do is they break into a store and they take all the stuff. Isn't that a great thought? Isn't that a wonderful feeling that you know that only the presence of armed police is keeping the person you just passed by on the streets from killing you and stealing your stuff? Wonderful. And this is why rooftop Koreans are, in my opinion, American heroes. Now, I want to give also some honest criticism to the Gilets jaunes, to the yellow vests. Now, there is a list of their demands, and I read through that. Now, I don't know if this is really representative of all of them or if they really have a leadership, but be that as it may, there is apparently some list of demands that they have. I don't want to go through every point, but some of the points can be summed up as they want lower taxes, they want more welfare, or at least stable welfare. They want to retire earlier. They want more teachers in the schools. They want higher overall wages. And they do not want to pay back some of their government debt because they think it's illegitimate. Now, I want to give you my honest opinion. This is like having your cake and eating it too. This sounds like a list of demands of a bunch of 5-year-olds who want candy and not go to bed. I mean, you have to decide where the money should come from if you want a lot of government spending and if you don't want higher taxes. Now, of course, you say you should tax international corporations or tax the rich, etc. And I don't really know the details. In Germany, there is also a discussion at the moment that these international internet corporations like Google or Amazon or Facebook, that they should be taxed higher because they don't really pay taxes here because they're internet companies, they can somehow do that. And yeah, we could look into that, but I'm just warning you that this might not give you that much government or state revenue, tax revenue as you think it would. And if you demand higher wages, well, then the prices for things will also go up. So if we look at where France is standing at the moment, as I said before, the ratio of government spending in GDP is really high in France. The debt in France is very high. You are taxation world champions and you're also welfare world champions, which kind of makes sense. But if you want more welfare and you want to still have open borders, well, to be fair, the list of demands said that if people cannot claim asylum successfully, they should be sent home to their countries of origin. At least they are realistic in that sense. But if you would give tax cuts to tens of millions of French people while at the same time lowering the age of retirement or keeping the pension stable or even increasing them and keeping up the welfare payments that you have right now, this only means you would make new debt. You will have to take this money from somewhere. And if you say at the same time that you don't want to pay back your debt that you already have, at least partially, who is going to borrow you that money? Where do you take it from? Seriously. People from abroad, like foreign states or banks, will not give you money under these circumstances. I mean, if a friend of mine would ask for money every week and never pay it back, okay, not never, but say he wouldn't pay back some of it maybe, then I would be very hesitant to give him money actually. And when it comes to rich people, well, it's not like rich people aren't taxed already very much in France. Nobody really wants to start a business in France, it seems. And I also think that international corporations don't really think that France is the place to open a new factory right now because of taxation. And your productivity is actually the same as in Germany. The productivity is okay, but there are other problems in France that also need to be tackled. God knows I'm not a globalist, but there is a positive side to globalization, and that is that not every good or service that is sold or consumed in Germany must be produced in Germany. Some countries are better at certain things than others, and we all specialize. That is not in itself a bad thing, that is actually a very good thing, but we must be smart about that. And if we want to keep jobs, good jobs in the country, we must do several things. We must use legislation and state power. Or like Donald Trump, he's using tariffs in order to keep more jobs in the US, which I can understand. But at the same time, we must work on our productivity. Because if you want to have jobs in manufacturing, for example, you need a good infrastructure, you need well-educated and trained workers, and you need a high productivity per worker. So this is just my opinion, this is my perspective on the issue, and in my mind it is not realistic to just say, oh, we will tax the rich and we don't pay back our debt and we will increase welfare spending while we still have open borders and all these foreigners can just come in and claim welfare here. That will not work. And welfare spending, as I said, is at a record high in France. And I think if you want to solve part of your economic problems as a nation, you have to tackle this issue. It is very hard to do. We had this struggle in Germany, and not everything is perfect, obviously, but always ask yourself the question, who should pay for that? I always like to think quantitatively, and you don't need to get the second digit after the decimal point right, but just an order of magnitude estimate sometimes helps a lot. So let's take the average welfare tourist here. What does he cost the taxpayer? It would be something between 10 and 50,000 euros a year if you include housing, medication, food, and the money they get and all that stuff. Now, also you could include all the social workers, all the translators, all the doctors or the people that take them there and help them, all the police and the ambulances that you need when they have a Friday night of their liking. Now, if you multiply that by, let's say, 2 million people that we have in the country for sure that fall under that or a similar category, you will arrive at something between 20 and 100 billion euros a year. So that will be trillions of euros over the year. Now, who's gonna pay for that? Of course, we are paying for that, and this is why we cannot have tax cuts, and this is why the quality of healthcare and our social standards, our infrastructure, and all these things are getting worse. Just do the math. Just look at these numbers. This is a sizable chunk of our annual budget. These are not peanuts at all, and you have to ask yourself, where is it coming from? And we didn't have these expenses before. These are, at least in this order of magnitude, in this high category, it is an entirely new phenomenon. Europe didn't have that before. And you have to ask yourself these very important but very serious questions. Now, instead of going down this road that would lead us to something like North Korea, where you turn your entire country into a labor camp and nobody is allowed to get out, or we don't even have to go that far, just a little bit back in time, Eastern Germany, when it was under Soviet control, was a little bit like that. You were not allowed to leave and you had to work. Now, this is the logical conclusion of this way of thinking, that you want to have the same equal living conditions for everyone and you want to tax the rich. And what would you do then? The rich would actually leave the country, so you must make it illegal to leave the country and you must confiscate all their wealth. And once you have confiscated it and once you have consumed all that money, guess what? There is no wealth anymore, and this figure that is currently 56% in France, that is the ratio of government spending from GDP, will maybe go up to 90%. And then we're truly in North Korea. So maybe I'm exaggerating this point a little bit and maybe I'm talking a little bit too much about that aspect, but a lot of these demands are economic in nature. A lot of it is about taxes and it is about welfare and retirement age and average minimum wages or something like that. So I think it's not very much off topic to ask some questions about that. What kind of country do you actually want? And realistically ask, who is gonna pay for it? And not just be dismissive and say, oh, we take it from the rich. France is not a country where in the last decades no one has had this idea. Sure, you can increase taxes for higher incomes and you can give tax cuts to people with lower incomes. You can also actually confiscate the property of very wealthy individuals, but always bear in mind that these things have consequences. People might not be motivated to work hard anymore or to excel in France, and they will just go elsewhere and you will lose the brightest people. I also know that France will never become a libertarian utopia, but just bear in mind that when you implement measures like these rather socialist policies, bear in mind that you don't go over the top with it. Don't be too extreme, because these things will have consequences. If I wanted to be very autistic and mean, I could say that you could sum up these claims and demands as I want to have high wages for 1 hour of my work, but everyone else around me should have very, very low wages for 1 hour of their work. In that way, with just 1 hour of my work, I can buy all the goods and services that they provide because they have to work for less. Taken to its, I admit, very artistic conclusion, that would mean slavery for everyone but you. So that means these socialists and these commies, they basically want to be dictators in a big slave plantation. And that sounds a little bit like real communism, where there was an avant-garde and party elite and all the rest of the people were basically inmates in a labor camp. But of course, I would only say that if I wanted to be really mean. Instead, you can just maybe invade your neighbors, like occupy the Rhineland. That is also a viable solution, I'm sure. Okay, enough nasty talk for our Western neighbors now. Even though I was a little bit critical in the end, I have to state that I see these protests as a positive thing. Actually, I can totally understand that the rural population is fed up, in France especially, and I also think that Emmanuel Macron is a very bad president. And I also have to say, yeah, looking back, I did videos on the French elections, the presidential elections last time, and they were also smug and they were patting themselves on the back for uniting all against Marine Le Pen, that everyone who is not of the former Front National, now Rassemblement National, I think, they all forget their differences and they stand together against the right and they make sure that a moderate centrist will become our president. And he looks so smart and he looks so pretty in his suit, and he actually is married to an older woman that groomed him when he was just a child. And now let's see how popular he still is. You were so smart, French people, huh? This is an example, I think, that no matter what is normally not a very good idea. And they thought that they want to make sure that Marine Le Pen would not be president no matter what. And this no matter what kind of stance actually came back and kicked them in the ass. Because guess what? Macron is not the president of the French. He's the president of the foreigners. Now, of course, I fully acknowledge that the situation in Germany is the same. We also have a cartel of parties that unite against the right, and they make sure that the AfD does not come into power or even participate in a government no matter what. So the situation is the same, okay? I'm not pointing fingers at France. I'm saying the same thing about my own country. So as long as they're not violent and looting like some of the people in Paris, I'm all for these protests. And I wish that they stay safe and that nobody gets harmed and that they get their way within reason. Anybody who made it through this unstructured rant, you have my gratitude and my admiration. Servus, Kameraden.